I have a few words to introduce you to our audience. Well, here in Waterloo, you are still very well known because you are one of our highly deserving alumni. You took your BA and MA degrees in classical studies by 2022, and here you worked especially on ancient Greek colonization. Your master's thesis was on the Phocaean colonization in the archaic period, and your work has been interested in contrasting the often simplistic assumptions that we have when we think and speak of Greek colonization and ethnic identity development with the literary and archaeological evidence for the Phocaeans throughout the Mediterranean world. And you have developed these questions further now in your PhD project that you're pursuing at the University of Toronto. And the title of your work currently is Greek Colonization in the Periphery, Foundation Development and Identity in Remote Apoikiai. But I would like to mention two other points of your work. You have, since I got to know you, I think that was in 2017, you had a very keen interest in historical geography and mapping, and you have been a little contagious in this. So I'm very grateful that with your help, we were able to produce several historical maps together, and I encourage everyone to check them out. They are still on my website, altaijoshkun.com maps, but many of them are now also available on Wikipedia, and many of them are dedicated to mapping colonial, archaic Greek colonial movements. So that's one further aspect. The other is whenever I have conversations with you, I'm struck by your global perspectives, by your ability to bring by comparanda, not just from different continents, but also from different millennia. And that makes every conversation and discussion with you very educational. And I have seen in the abstract that your presentation today also tries to put the questions that we are pursuing into a much wider and more deeply reflected context. So we are all looking forward to listening to your paper, Gendered Narratives of Foundation and Settlement Across Cultures. So.
Yes, thank you, Altai. I have to say, I'm rather sorry that I'm not there in person. I got very sick on Friday, so my apology for not being there, because I really do intend to be there in person, but instead I will talk to everyone remotely. Thank you for the kind introduction. The title, as you can see on my slide, is actually slightly different now. The current title is Consent Scripts at First Contact, Female Authorization in Foundation Narratives. The original title that you see on the abstract was a bit of a placeholder because I couldn't decide on what a good title I really wanted. But this is, if you've read my abstract, you know this is directly connected to what I'm trying to argue for today. And I will just quickly read the first part of my abstract. I said that across cultures and periods, foundation legends of all sorts repeatedly tackle the problem of foreign presence by introducing a female mediator whose actions, whether it's marriage, warning, rescue, betrayal, or sacrifice, make settlement appear authorized rather than imposed. And this process may therefore be reasonably termed a consent script, that is, a reusable story module that provides a somewhat rational explanation for the settlement through legitimizing stories of consent and authorization, often, but not always, involving local or indigenous participation. That is essentially the kind of a bigger structural definition that I have for what I call consent scripts. But here I also offer you some more kind of a layered definitions, each of them unique, but they're also very much interconnected. They highlight different aspects of what I see as, consent scripts, this phenomenon across a variety of, well, as we'll see, pretty much all over the world, actually, across all periods. So already we see that structurally it's a reusable plot module in Foundation and First Contact Tales. And that slash there is important because, as you will see in my arguments, that this is, in my view, not strictly applicable to just kind of a colonial context, but first context of all sorts. So this then mediates the newcomer's arrival so that settlement or displacement appears authorized by insiders, divinity, nature, or some kind of a recognized order. And it is also simultaneously, therefore, a legitimizing tool that often converts coercion or asymmetry into invitation or destiny by forging kingship, treaty, or sacrosanction. It thus functions as a charter for sovereignty, property, and jurisdiction. And on the long run, then, it served as a memory regime that fixes authorization in rituals, cults, genealogies, toponyms, monuments, anniversaries, etc., and thus creating a durable consent. Okay, that I have a typo there since I was still polishing, but yeah, basically, then on the long run, then this is to maintain and to have a continuous presence of this consent in the power structure. And this consent script can take on a great variety of forms. So the rest of my presentation will basically be showing you different forms that I have identified. And towards the end, I will demonstrate how I am currently in the process of putting them into a prototypology for consent scripts. So first is the most commonly occurring form is basically a treaty or marriage structure. I will talk only very briefly about Massalia, since Mata has already talked about this, and I know Altai is going to talk about Massalia in length. But the basic scenario, as we already seen, is that the local bride choosing ceremony in Massalia, the princess, whether her name is Gyptis or Petta, then hands the cup to a Phocaian arrival, and his name can be either Proteus or Euxino, depending on which tradition was transmitted. And then the father of the princess, King Nanos of the Segobrigi, a Ligurian tribe, then accepts, and Massalia is therefore founded. And we see descendants, the Proteidae, persist in the city of Massalia for generations, centuries to come. And so I put the script function of this scenario essentially as local female choice and the paternal consent authorized Greek settlement as hospitality and alliance. And again, since Mata and other authors, other people here are going to talk about it in further detail, so I'm just going to quickly skip this part. And in the bottom, I have two images. One is from a 19th century French engraving, precisely depicting the scene of the handling of the cup to the Phocaian arrival. And then to the right is a sculpture in the vaults of the old stock exchange in Marseille that depicts the foundation of the city. I want to then move on to another, which I will also consider be in the same general vein of treaty of marriage, and this is the East Asian. Traditionally, you will see this as identified as a purely Chinese tradition, but I would totally argue against that. I think it's a broadly East Asian, Inner Asian tradition, which is called the heqin. This roughly translates to peace marriage, or sometimes peace through marriage. So it's a kind of a diplomacy that binds monarchs to neighboring polities. And usually we have princesses, usually come from minor branches of the ruling family, and sometimes other court women, they're married off to the other states in order to maintain peace or solidify alliances. So sometimes it's interpreted as appeasement, other times as a kind of diplomatic maneuvering. There's a variety of interpretive position that you can take regarding the purpose of a heqin. But in terms of the script function, we see in a lot of the stories is that this, again, is marriage used to authorize kind of frontier presence and also in the Chinese context, frontier markets. And then the narrative frame is the frame intermarriage as peacemaking consent that domesticates asymmetry that existed prior to the initiation of the heqin ceremony. And then sometimes we even see this as the kind of a mythological basis for nation building. And I list here sources for each of my scenarios. So in previous slides, I have those for the Massalia, and here there's simply too many sources because this is a long tradition across millennia. So it's mainly we find in various Chinese histories, travel logs, but also lots of Buddhist texts, both in Chinese and in a variety of other languages, and of course the Dunhuang manuscripts. And the two images I have here, the left is a 16th hand scroll painting depicting a scene of heqin. This is one of the probably more famous story of heqin in Chinese history, the Wang Zhaojun, which was a Han dynasty courtesan who was picked to be married off to the Xiongnu. And the right side this is from Dunhuang, from one of the Mogao cave, where a daughter of the king of Khotan, then it was married to the ruler of Dunhuang, Khotan being a non-Chinese polity at the time, whereas Dunhuang was ruled by a Chinese family. So here again, we see it's not just major Chinese dynasties or empires who are pursuing these policies, but they're also, this is kind of a very, very common in all sorts of East Asian and Inner Asian diplomatic maneuverings. Now, that's on its own, it doesn't really sort of fit the tone what I was trying to talk about consent script, which is why I have to give you what I think is very pertinent focus example of the heqin tradition, which is the case of Tashikotigan. So here the scenario, and we get this mostly from Xuanzang, which is a 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk who took a very long circuitous journey to India, and through his journey he traveled through all of Inner Asia. So from his accounts, we learn that there was in what is today Xinjiang, China, a Han princess there was a Han princess traveling for a diplomatic marriage, that is a heqin with a Persian monarch. The name there was particularly interesting, but it's beyond the scope of this presentation. So I will just, unless there arises any question, I will not talk about that further. But she was stranded on a high cliff because there was some local unrest. And while she was stranded, she became pregnant. And this episode was then interpreted by the locals at wherever that cliff was located as a solar marriage, a hirogami, if you will, between the princess and the sun god. And so she bears a son who then became king, and subsequent generations would continue to rule at this kingdom, which Xuanzang called Chepantuo, or in, I think, Sanskrit, Kapanda. So this story then became part of the origin myth of Tajiks in China. And I personally had the privilege of visiting Tashkent again a couple of years back. And you can clearly see that there's still a kind of a recurring motif reflected in a lot of local arts and local music and traditions. And today, the site is therefore identified with the city of Tashkent again. And there is still the main citadel is still called the Princess Castle. And there is a variety of explanation for why that is the case. But of course, Xuanzang's story is featured very, very big in those explanations. And here, again, I think the script function uses heqin, which on its own doesn't necessarily tie into what, the kind of a consent script, but it uses heqin as a pretext to lead to this kind of hirogami. Again, the woman's body is the mediating factor that gives legitimacy through a kind of a dual lineage. So the self-designation functions as a naming and a lineage charter, and recording asymmetry presence as destined sovereignty. And in the Chinese text, it's very interesting, and that is, I think, something that's been passed down orally through the centuries, is that they have this kind of a saying that our mothers are Han and our fathers are of the Sun, and so we're called the stock of the Sun and the Han. And so that's kind of the story that then gets kind of permeated and becoming kind of very foundational to the ethnic building, the identity of the Tajiks in China, which again, is part of the bigger ethnic group as the Tajiks, but they have their very distinct traditions and their cultures from, for example, the Tajiks in Tajikistan and in Afghanistan. And so towards the bottom, the left this is an early picture. I think it's from 1909 from a French traveler who was traveling in Afghanistan, and this is. And the castle was in better shape at the time. Now it's kind of it's more dilapidated. And then right is a picture of the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who gave us this account. And then further on, this is perhaps more close in mind to the Massalia tradition. I give the example of Soma and Cordinia. So here I assume that this would be really wading into unfamiliar territories for a lot of us. And I do apologize because originally I want to have some handouts, but there's a lot of stories for everyone, every one of these cases. So, but the gist it was that there was a local princess called Soma of the tribe of Naga in what is today Cambodia. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this kind of a broader Southeast Asian Indian tradition, you will know that naga means a serpent, and that's exactly, this is kind of a cross-cultural link that we find in a lot of these traditions. So she was this kind of a serpent princess, a bit of a autochthonic presence, if you will. And then there was Kaldinia, who, according to various accounts, was either a merchant traveling, a Brahmin class merchant traveling from India, or even more curiously, the Chinese annals actually interpreted him to be a Chinese. And we'll see that is actually important. But either case, while Kaldinia was traveling, then his ship was attacked by pirates led by Soma, right? So Soma was this kind of local presence. So she and Kaldinia engaged in a fight. Then Kaldinia fought back and then fended off the attackers. And Soma became so impressed, so she offered marriage. And through their union, the nation of Funan was then founded. And this is then traditionally interpreted as symbolizing the birth of Khmer or Kampuja traditions, which modern Cambodia still claims heritage to. So here the script function, why I interpret it as a matrilineal transfer of legitimacy from local serpent princess to this newcomer, and the union then naturalizes foreign rule. And this is the kind of probably a more common, more cosmopolitan model that we see a lot. I put a couple of examples in there. There's Aeneas and Lavinia, there's Dona Isabel, which I will come back to when we talk about Malinche, La Malinche. And then, of course, in Sri Lanka, there's this very, very similarly construed story of Vijaya and Kuveni, which again involves an Indian male high-class priest / Brahmin traveling to a foreign land and then having in this union, or first through some combat, some violence, but then eventually joining union with this kind of local representative who is usually a woman. And here I have some images to kind of show you. On the left here, this is a very recently inaugurated statue in Cambodia, in Sihanoukville, Cambodia, that depicts the couple, Soma and Kaldinia, which of course in the Khmer tradition, they have a lot of different, they have various retellings, so their names are different and there are specific plots are different. And on the right here, there's a modern reproduction of an old-style Khmer statue of Kaldinia. I mentioned that in some accounts, we actually see, this is particularly in the Chinese Book of Liang, which is from, I believe, the 6th century CE, where the Kaldinia is actually given a different, he's given a Chinese name. So in that story, it's reported that the Funan themselves, they make a woman, and then the monarch then surrendered to this new Chinese merchant. And so this, I don't have the time to get into it, but this seems to me can mean either that there were competing interpretations or narratives trying to claim some kind of linkage or heritage to Khmer, or this could simply be a misinterpretation or mistranslation. But either way, it is very interesting that within this kind of broaderly connected world that we have very kind of a similar story but told through different lenses and perhaps for different motives and agendas. And this again, so now going from the kind of a treaty marriage module to a kind of what I call heroic mediation module or consent script. The example of Lampsake, as Marta has already talked about, so I'm not going to talk too much about the scenario we're now familiar with. Basically, Lampsake, right, daughter of this local king of the Bebrikes, Mandron, and warns the Phocine sellers, Phobos, right, of this local indigenous plot to overthrow them. And the Greek sees the city, then she is later honored and divinized, and the city then renamed Lampsakos. And so here then we have a local or indigenous woman's warning or betrayal, licensing foreign takeover. And then the eponymy therefore fixes legitimacy. And in this tradition, as it has already been discussed, we actually see kind of a broad cross-Mediterranean comparanda, but also I tried to find also non-Western, non-Mediterranean examples. But the examples here I listed the unnamed Ligurian woman, right? The one who then tried to warn the Massiliates, but then of course the Massiliates then take heed and then they killed all the Komatos and his supporters. But also in the Roman tradition, we can think of the myth of Tarpeia, right? And of course, Pacific Mata already mentioned. And in the biblical tradition, perhaps we can even think of Rahab, right, in the fall of Jericho, and the Michal as well in the Vietnamese tradition, right? Similarly, she was in love with a foreign prince, and then therefore she tried to kind of show him the secrets of his own kingdom, of her own kingdom, and as a result, the kingdom fell to the enemies, things like that. This is again kind of a the exact takeaway or the lessons, the philosophies that different traditions trying to take from these stories usually differ. But I feel that in my analysis, the kind of the base script and their function are very, very similar. And so I don't really have good pictures to show you about Lampsake, since today it's not a major city. It's today it's Lampsake in Turkey. I have some coinage because one thing interesting is obviously, do we have Lampsake on Lampsakine coinage? And the answer is still, I think, no, or at least we don't know of. There are some, I think, especially on the gold staters, there are some of, so because on obverse it's usually a female figure, some of them has been definitively identified as Aphrodite and also as Hera, some of them not so much. And then in the earlier silver coins, for example, on the right, usually have this Jenny form, right? So the double-headed female heads, and the interpretation of these, also there is some controversies of how exactly to identify them. But again, this is just to give you a kind of brief idea of this. But again, it's not entirely, it wouldn't surprise me at all if, for example, the female figure to the left or something similar to it is then identified as Lampsake. That would also not be improbable. Then again, in this kind of a heroic mediation, but then now pushing to even more greater length, we can speak of heroic sacrifice, right? Of course, we can argue that what Lampsake did and what, for example, the unnamed Ligurian woman did were also a great act of sacrifice, right? Even whether they were doing that out of love, out of some kind of duty or obligation. But here we have these kind of even more overt stories of sacrifice. And these two, I think, are particularly interesting. So the first is the story of Wairaka. So this is again from New Zealand. This is from the Maori tradition. Wairaka was the daughter of Toroa, who was the captain of captain and therefore the navigator of the Matatua Waka. Waka is a canoe. So Matatua is one of the great voyaging canoes by which Polynesians first migrated to New Zealand, right? So this is all transmitted to us through our oral traditions. But when Matatua came to what is today Wakatane, and all the men get on shore. But the Maori tradition forbade women to ever handle a canoe, right? So she cannot pilot the canoe. That is strictly taboo, which of course is a word that comes from tapu, right? So, and while the men are on shore, there were some waves, then the ship started to getting adrift. So someone has to do something to save all their lives. So naturally, Wairaka stepped up and then she defied tapu to save this canoe. And her shouting phrase, "Kia wakatane ariaho," I will act the part of a man, then gave name to Wakatane, which is today a town and a district in New Zealand. And the second example here is from Africa, Queen Pokou of the Baule people, which is in Western Africa. Today, it would be within the boundary of Ivory Coast. I try not to use modern nation because, again, we know those borders are very arbitrarily drawn by European colonial administrations. The original boundaries was, kind of very, very fluid. But either way, Pokou. So there were several different oral traditions, but the broad gist was that she was leading a group of refugees of her people, and they were kind of on this large migratory journey, and they came upon a river that's uncrossable. And so she then asked her priest for advice, and the priest told her that she had to sacrifice a noble child in order to cross the river. And so Pokou then sacrificed her own son, throwing the infant into the water. And then the legend has it that after the sacrifice, a lot of hippopotami then appeared and formed a bridge in which then Pokou and her people then used to cross to the opposite bank. And once there, she exclaimed, "Bauli," which means the child is dead. And that is why her descendants today are known as Baule people. here, I think it's interesting. The script function, again, this is all my interpretation, right? So I'm identifying what I see as similarities, but of course there can be different interpretations. What I see is that we have this exceptional female action or sacrifice, sanctifying place and people, and the naming therefore encodes legitimacy. And what's even more interesting in both traditions, contrary to what we've seen, for example, with the colonial or colonization narratives in the Greco-Roman antiquity or in other contexts, here it is not to displace a population. In particular, in the Maori context, we know very, very, very well that New Zealand was uninhabited, right? So what we see here, really, this is purely first contact. Well, not even first contact, first contact with a new land, right? Not with people, but with land. So the kind of the mitigating factor, the recognized order that gives legitimacy is usually something related to nature, right? Rather than to kind of local power structure, especially when there's no local polity to speak of. Even though we still see, again, this kind of, the usage, the authorization process through the actions, and here in particularly the words, right, of female figures. And of course, these all transmitted to us through folklores and oral traditions. And on the left, there is, I show you, it's not very clear, but it's a modern statue of Wairaka in Wakatane. This was built in 1965. And then on the right is a modern, well, it's not modern, it's a 16th, 17th century body mask from what is modern Ivory Coast. Now, lastly, I want to talk about yet another, I think, different model within the kind of what I all come together as consent scripts, and that is linguistic brokerage. And the best example here is obviously La Malinche, right? So I assume she is relatively well known, but for those of you who are not familiar, she was a Nahua woman. She was enslaved and gifted to the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez in 1519. She was then baptized as her name was Marina, so which is why she's also sometimes called Doña Marina. So she spoke Nahuatl and Maya, and paired with Jeronimo de Aguilar, she became Cortez's indispensable interpreter and envoy. And through her speech acts, she therefore forged alliances, especially with the Tlaxcala, and she secured submissions, and she helped stage Spanish demands as agreements. And there are also many accounts that credit her with the exposing of the Cholula plot, which nearly, upended the entire mission of Cortez. So, and therefore enable Cortez's later advance on Tenochtitlan. So her sexual and household tie to Cortez, right? So she bore him a son, would later made her into a very prominent but also very controversial symbol, right? In Mexican nationalist discourse, she is called a traidora, right? A traitor, and then there's the word malinchismo, right? Malinchism, and but of course, there's also things, particularly in more recent scholarship, we see her as kind of a coercive, highly agentive mediator, right, whose own linguistic and diplomatic labor also shaped conquest era consent in a way. And of course, throughout the New World, right, especially throughout Latin America, we see a lot of examples like her, even though they are not as prominent or as well known. In Colombia, there's India Catalina, right, and we already talked about Doña Isabel or Isabel Moctezuma, right, who is recognized as the legitimate successor to Moctezuma, and all of these stories. And of course, here I give also Truganini, who was kind of collaborator, interpreter, if you will, a language mediator in the British suppression of the indigenous people in Australia, especially in Tasmania. And of course, Sarah Winnemucca, right, in her role in Nevada, and in the United States in particular, we can find quite a lot of similar examples, and with kind of a similarly mixed legacy, especially in popular imagination. And here in the bottom, I demonstrate a kind of dual imagination, different kind of interpretation, right? To the left, this is a statue group called the Monumental Art Mestizaje, right? So the kind of monument to miscegenation, right? Which is creation of essentially what the current Mexican national identity of a mixed race people is based on. Therefore, her role as the first mestiza is celebrated. But also, I think at least starting in the 19th century, we have, as I said, this tradition to depict her and people like her as traitors. So this is probably the most famous engraving of La Malinche, called the Dona Marina la Traidora, right? She as casting her as a traitor. So I have already talked a lot about consent scripts, and so I want to just kind of pull back a little bit and talk about what I think they do. So, and I put that bracket often because obviously this is very, very broad, and I'm kind of seeing similarities across a multitude of different traditions and different time periods. So there's only so much we can say in terms of similarity. But what I do observe is that, broadly speaking, they first display violence by recruiting conquest as invitation or sometimes as kind of a destiny, especially if we speak of, when we are kind of conquering nature in a way. And they also establish gender sovereignty by investing legitimacy in female bodies, voices, and names. They localize power by embedding newcomers in kingship and ritual. And they also produce memory by fixing authorization through rituals, festivals, and toponyms. So then this brings me to essentially a kind of, this is still very rudimentary, I have to say, I have to admit, this is in no way good. It's very imperfect, but I am in the process of trying to, crack out a kind of a comparative typology to these consent scripts. So here we have different types, right? Treaty marriage, heroic mediation, linguistic brokerage, but there are also the counter scripts, right? Where contrary to what I just talked about, it does not displays violence, but rather that violence has already taken place, right? Think of, for example, the abduction of the Saban women, things like that, where initial violence abduction then necessarily is reinterpreted as kind of post hoc reconciliation, right? So the victim is then recasted as the mediator, which still, in my mind, fits, broadly speaking, within this general theme of consent scripts. And again, this is very elementary. I'm still working on this. This is very much a work in progress because this very likely will be a big part of my doctoral research. So this is still in kind of an early phase of it. But let me conclude by just kind of talking broadly about some of these things. So I think taking these together, this lets us see consent not as a checkbox. And of course, here, very importantly, by consent, this is it does not really mean consent in a way that it's demonstrable volition. It's a narrative effect, right? So when we see that authorizing consent, it doesn't mean that the actors, especially the female actors there, were really consenting to what's being done. Rather, this is a narrative effect that creates this imagery of consent. And so authorization is often done by speech and ritual, right? Betrothals, oath, treaties, name givings, and by the maternal afterlife of those acts. Sorry, the material afterlife of those acts. So walls, shrines, festivals, genealogies, place names. The price of this authorization is therefore often that women's bodies, voices, names are instrumentalized, right? The adulterer marries, a heroine is divinized, translator speaks for others. The script therefore launders coercion by making it memorable as kingship or cult. Methodologically, a typology of consent scripts, I think, can offer us a portable vocabulary for comparing origin stories across regions and periods. It would suggest a set of diagnostic questions like who speaks, who is authorized, what violence is forgotten, and that we can all bring to new corpora, right? Southeastern Asian Chronicles, Steppe Borderland Tales, Atlantic World Foundation stories, and much, much more. And it can also invite collaboration with, of course, archaeology, historical linguistics, indigenous scholarship in particular, right, to test where the script align with and where it departs from material and various oral histories. And in terms of kind of follow up for what we can do further, I think there are two next steps that we can follow. First is to build a kind of a coded data set of foundation narratives keyed to the markers outlined in my presentation today, which would allow us to kind of map the geography of authorization, if you will, and to visualize how different types cluster or shift over time. And secondly, we can kind of examine modern reactivations of consent scripts, right? Heritage festivals, tourism, iconography, sometimes even school curricula, where the past is continually curated to stabilize present claims. And if we as communities, if let's say we live inside stories of how we came to be here, then consent scripts are the way those stories make our arrival feel welcome in a way. And so attending to the forms does not simply debunk them, it clarifies how legitimacy is made, remembered, and sometimes contested. And it opens space to listen for the voices that these scripts have oftentimes muted. Thank you very much. That will conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Stone. That was quite a thing. It was highly impressive. The examples that you've been really pulling from all around the globe, from throughout the millennia, and not just throwing these examples at us, but also trying to really digest them and bring them into a potential typology. And I think that's something that we're gonna work on over the next couple of years. I would be lying if I said I could take in all the examples. I really have to go through all the examples again. But I'm sure there are many questions or comments in either of our audiences. Sure.
Thank you very much for the very convincing talk. So I'm astonished by all the parallels and patterns you have shown, and it was very convincing for me. And it seems to me you can find the same patterns again and again in many parts of the world. So I was wondering if there are examples where it could not work, or are there cultures or historical scenarios where it is not possible to work with these female roles, with the narratives that you have presented? So are there certain conditions that are important so that these narratives can work? Could you say something about that?
Could you repeat the latter part, please? I
Okay.
want to better understand.
So I'm wondering if there are, let us say, examples or certain situations, certain historical scenarios or cultures where the narratives you have shown did not work or where they could not be used. So it seemed to me that you can almost find in any culture you have shown find such patterns. So I'm wondering if there are some, let us say, negative examples where it is not working, where you cannot create such a narrative or such female roles in founding stories. Are there examples for that?
Yes, of course, absolutely. Yes, there are a lot of examples, and in my search, for example, the Lampsake typology, I was really eager to find if that kind of a story, especially that involves the betrayal of an indigenous woman of her own people or something like that, can be found in other traditions. And I do find it difficult to really, for example, find that in the vast trove of Indian or East Asian traditions, and which I think Marta mentioned something of that there being probably, broadly speaking, kind of a Mediterranean model or Near Eastern model. That's kind of, so that's probably, there are some of these script types I think are more localized in a way, that they're more kind of, you find them more often in one region of the world, and you don't find them at all in other places. And this is part of what I mean when I say that next text is kind of to map this out and see the geography of them, right? And they do have different distributions. And of course, the points I do these kind of identify similarities, obviously it's easy sometimes to fall into the trap of just kind of seeing things where they are known, right? So I think in generally speaking, I do think that almost every tradition has similar stories that can be, in my view, casted as a kind of a consent script that plays similar functions, even though their particular type can vary a lot. But that being said, I would totally accept that there will be places where you just can't find anything like that, or for example, the gender roles are completely reversed or things like that, and that's also very, very normal, because what I'm building here, I don't intend it to be kind of some kind of a universal model. It's merely to show it's so right now you can see it's still kind of a comparative approach. Eventually, I want to shift from comparative to connective, and to see that there could be, of course, kind of a trans-regional links that can maybe on a macro historical level explain some of these connections, but that's in the future. And I don't expect that kind of work or explanation to be universally applicable. Yes, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for the insight.
Thank you, both of you. I would have another question that also is about the major conceptualization. It was quite interesting how you did change your topic because, and not the topic, but the title, because the gendered narratives was quite all embracing, and it was very easy to present very diverse examples and then work towards a typology or a model. Whereas your new title, Consent Scripts, is quite specific and tries to be or reflect the conclusion or the preliminary conclusion that you have drawn. And you are still working on it, and you see that is still some potential problem with it, trying to embrace all the diverse examples under a term like consent. And then you try to modify or help us understand by saying it's more about the creation of an imagery of consent. I found that also quite interesting. Now, I was wondering when you were going through the examples, I did not always see consent, but rather I saw potential strategies of legitimization. And they can be much broader. And one strategy of which we have already seen, whether they involve women or not, is conquest. Right? It's a very brutish form of legitimization in many different cultural traditions. And there is a mix of the tradition of, well, say mixed marriage or peace marriage, as you've called it, on the one hand, and also conquest. And in the examples, especially that Marta gave, and also the Lampsake example that you resumed, we actually have these different strategies mixed. So I wonder when we try to relate these different terms to each other, would you agree that overall all these stories kind of pursue strategies of legitimization? And would you then say that those stories involving women in prominent roles, that they tend to use them to project an idea of consent, and even where consent does not really work, it is just a variation of the main type of consent production. So perhaps the most prominent example where it does not work is the CDK example, or the girl from Metimna, varied then with Tarpeia, where in fact there is so much disdain of that traitor. But you would still say that, or could you then explain how that still leads to a potential consent, or would you then rather agree that no, consent is not the useful term here? So that's where I'm still wrestling, trying to bring the different strands of your ideas together.
Yes. Yes, thanks, Altai. That's a very good question. So I will first just comment on nomenclature. I don't think this would be the kind of final word that I would use. So consent script, this is something that I'm still developing kind of organically as I go through with my research. So this could change. Maybe we can use authorization, perhaps a better or more kind of a catch-all label for it, and then more applicably. So the reason I originally used consent here was to sort of just highlight, as you see, that it's the first layer is really legitimizing, but after that, it's sort of giving a kind of a more subtle, kind of a nuanced interpretation where all of this is just reasonable, and not just reasonable. You should embrace it, you should accept it, and that's the kind of where I originally got the idea of consent from. And there are, of course, examples where I think you're right that this probably isn't all that useful. And so, but going back to the the Tarpeia or the Pacifique examples, I put those as kind of you could say mirrored or are kind of reverse comparanda to the story of Lampsake. And of course, in those cases, the story progressed to a very different place. However, the mechanism, or I would say the kind of the use, or if you think about what exactly was intended by placing or kind of scripting a female role in that particular place, I do think even though the story are different, I think there are some similarities there. That what they were trying to do, or what they're intending, or rather what they were trying to let the audience, the readers, to think about that through a particular lens. I think there's some broad similarities, so to speak, and so yeah, I think in the long run, I am still not fixed on what terminology I will use for this kind of a broad similarity across cultures in these female roles in first contact narratives. And this may be a kind of a subgroup, but there may be better, kind of a bigger umbrella label that I can use. I don't know. Did I answer that question, or you want to push on some more?
Well, so I understand that this is still an ongoing process, and that we share the fascination and attraction by the notion of consent script, and that women can actually be employed in this creation of the imagery on the one hand, but on the other hand, it does not always seem to work fully. So it's good to keep the discussion going, and it might help also to include one, to remind ourselves of Marta's presentation, where she put forward the notion of love as such a prominent force in so many stories that come from a slightly different angle, but it's good to see these different concepts that work, at least in many but not all stories, and see how we then may develop a typology that embraces these helpful categories without generalizing too much. I might add, I might add a question. Could you say, I gave a few statements as to how you define the relation between historicity, the historical role or roles of women in foundation context in your global perspective on the one hand, as compared to the role that women have in the literary or narrative traditions about them, because many of the examples, or some of the examples you showed, seem to have a more symbolic function, and others really showcased fully historical women out of flesh and blood. Can you give us some hints or some ideas as to how you try to reflect on the difference between a virtual reality and a historical reality?
Right. Thanks. So in this present study, I think you could probably tell that I am not that concerned with historicity, even though I fully acknowledge that a lot of these stories, legends, and oral traditions, they are not historical. But from a kind of a narrative study point of view, I don't think historicity is necessarily all that important, because I am focusing on, because these are things that are to this day remembered, commemorated, and still kind of propagated in all these various traditions. And so their specific historicity isn't something that the people who kind of recite them or take faith in them or believe them or necessarily care about, I would say. And so I am more interested in just how the fact that these accounts exist themselves can tell us about whether there are certain kind of basic foundational rules, or not even necessarily rules, but just kind of operational mechanisms that that would place kind of female figure and voice and bodies in these kind of typological contexts, I would say. So but I think in cases where we can, obviously, conduct more rigorous research in sort of a distinguishing between historical accounts and the kind of a legendary. So, for example, if we're studying Massalia, or especially all these Greco-Roman examples, I do think it is important to think about, and especially because in this case we're benefited from having more textual and archaeological sources where that can really help us distinguish and sort of take out elements that we think are ahistorical. In a lot of the other traditions, especially the last one, like the one from Authorization and from West Africa, where it's purely oral. There is probably not even archaeology to speak of, and so in those cases, it's kind of if I may ventriloquize Walter Scheidel a little bit, it's like how he says that ancient history is a kind of a developmental processes. So in that case, you could sort of think of these female lead stories as in a kind of a developmental phase in sort of the self-reflection and identity building of various peoples, and that on its own is valuable, whether that's really rooted in real history or not. So that's, I think, what I think.
Thank you very much. When there are more questions, please stay in touch with Stone. We now have lunch kind of on the table and are going into our lunch break. But please join me in thanking Stone once again for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.